Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. A man returns to restore his grandfather's forgotten mountain cabin, only to face a powerful HOA hell-bent on erasing it. What begins as quiet craftsmanship soon spirals into sabotage, surveillance, and a legal war that uncovers a darker nationwide conspiracy. I arrived at the cabin on a cold, clear morning, the kind Colorado does best. Thin air, sharp light, and a silence that feels deliberate. The dirt road ended 100 yards before the tree line, and from there, I carried my tools in by hand, like my grandfather used to. The cabin sat exactly where I remembered it from childhood, half swallowed by pine and scrub oak, its roof sagging under decades of neglect, but its bones still stubbornly intact. Hand-hewn beams, stone chimney laid without mortar, timber joints cut by someone who trusted his hands more than blueprints. This place hadn't been abandoned. It had been waiting. I spent the first day doing nothing but assessing damage. No romantic nonsense, no nostalgia haze, just structure, load paths, rot lines. The south wall had shifted an inch and a half off true. The ridge beam was cracked, but not failed. Whoever built this thing in the 1920s knew exactly what they were doing, because by any modern standard, it should have collapsed years ago. Instead, it was standing there, like an old soldier who refused to lie down. I filed my restoration notice with the county that same afternoon, attached my deed, survey, and the historical preservation intent. No HOA, no easements, no shared access. Private land, clean chain of title. No surprises. I don't move unless the paperwork moves first. By the second morning, I had scaffolding up and the rotten exterior boards stacked for salvage sorting. I wasn't replacing them with new lumber. Every piece was either going back after treatment or being matched with reclaimed timber from the same period. That kind of work takes time, and time is something people like me respect. Apparently, people like Pine Mirror don't. They showed up mid-morning on the third day, right on schedule for people who think intimidation works best before lunch. 3 of them, clean boots, pressed jackets, clipboard confidence. They stopped just short of my property line like they were afraid the dirt might stain their shoes. The man in front introduced himself as if I was supposed to care, then informed me, politely smugly, that my construction activity violated the visual harmony of the Pine Mirror residential community. I didn't stop working while he talked. I kept scraping rot from a beam, listening, letting the silence do the heavy lifting. When he finished, I told him calmly and clearly that this was my land, that I was not under their jurisdiction, and that their visual harmony could file a complaint with the trees if it felt offended. He didn't like that. None of them did. The woman took notes like she was documenting a crime scene. The third one smiled without humor and said their board would be forced to take further action. I finally straightened up then, wiped my hands, and looked at all 3 of them. I told them that if anyone from their association crossed the property line again without permission, I'd treat it as trespassing and respond accordingly. Not a threat, a statement of procedure. They left without another word, but I recognized the look on their faces. I'd seen it overseas more times than I could count. The look people get when they realize you're not afraid of them, and they don't know what to do with that. That evening, I logged everything. Time, names, vehicle description, audio notes. Habit dies hard. I set up temporary cameras, not hidden, not aggressive, just present, and went back to work. The cabin didn't care about Pine Mirror. The beams didn't know what an HOA was. They only cared whether I did the job right. As the sun dropped behind the ridge and the forest went quiet again, I had the distinct feeling that someone, somewhere, was already deciding that paperwork hadn't worked and that something uglier was going to follow. By the next morning, Pine Mirror had decided I wasn't a one-off inconvenience. I was a problem that needed a narrative. I noticed it before I ever heard from them again. Cars slowing down on the paved road beyond the trees, drivers craning their necks like tourists at a wreck. The cabin hadn't changed overnight, but perception had. Someone had already framed it as a threat. I kept working. That's always been my way of measuring seriousness. If I can still do the job while pressure builds, then the pressure is manageable. I reinforced the south wall, sistered the cracked beam, and started cataloging the iron fittings my grandfather had forged himself. Around noon, my phone started lighting up with unknown numbers. I let them ring. Voicemails piled up, polite at first, then irritated, then passive-aggressive. One message warned me that outside parties were concerned about safety. Another suggested that historic preservation was no excuse for eyesores. I saved everything. Tone matters later. That afternoon, a printed notice appeared at the edge of my driveway, staked into the dirt like a political sign. It wasn't official, no county seal, no legal reference, just HOA letterhead, and a lot of bold language about community standards. They were careful not to say they had authority. They implied it instead. That told me a lot about the advice they'd already received and chosen to ignore. Toward evening, I finally met Karen Lowry in person. She didn't cross the line, didn't raise her voice, didn't threaten me outright. She stood there with the confidence of someone who believed the world usually folded if she waited long enough. She talked about property values like they were sacred objects and described my cabin as if it were a contagious disease creeping toward her neighborhood. I let her talk. People reveal more when you don't interrupt. When she finished, I told her the same thing I'd told her representatives, only slower. My land was private, my permits were valid, my work was legal, and her HOA had no jurisdiction over any of it. I added that I'd already documented every attempt at interference, and that if she planned to escalate, she should do it openly so there'd be no confusion later. She smiled at that, tight, controlled, and said she hoped we could resolve things amicably. The word amicably came out sounding like a condition. That night, I reviewed my setup. Cameras adjusted, battery backups checked, tools locked down. Nothing theatrical, nothing excessive, just enough to make sure no one could claim confusion about boundaries. I didn't sleep much, but not because I was anxious. It was the old instinct kicking in, the sense you get right before someone decides rules no longer apply to them. Just before dawn, one of the cameras pinged. Nothing dramatic. A vehicle idling on the far road. Lights off. Engine running longer than necessary. Then gone. I saved the clip, labeled it, and went back to work as the sun came up. Whatever Pine Mirror thought they were protecting, they'd already crossed from aesthetics into obsession. And obsession, in my experience, never stays polite for long. The first thing I learned overseas was that intimidation rarely announces itself properly. It leaks. It tests. It waits for you to blink. By the time the black SUV rolled in, I'd already stopped treating Pine Mirror like a nuisance and started treating it like a variable. It was late morning when I heard tires where there shouldn't have been any. Not gravel crunching that I expect, but the muted, confident sound of a heavier vehicle easing in like it belonged there. I stepped out from under the scaffold and saw it sitting just outside the tree line, angled toward the cabin as if whoever parked it wanted a clear view without committing to anything. No plates, dark glass, clean body, not local. Two men got out, both dressed in black from boots to jackets, no patches, no logos, nothing to suggest who they worked for or why. They moved like people who'd practiced being seen without looking nervous. One of them lifted a phone immediately and started recording me. The other walked slow circles near the stack of lumber, snapping photos of my tools, the scaffolding, the beams I'd laid out for treatment. They didn't ask permission. They didn't introduce themselves. They acted like that part was beneath them. I didn't give them what they wanted. I didn't argue, didn't posture, didn't reach for anything dramatic. I pulled my own phone out and photographed them back. Faces, hands, boots, the SUV, the exact point where their tires crossed from public road to private dirt. When the one with the phone finally spoke, it wasn't loud or aggressive. It was casual, almost bored. "You were warned," he said. "Now there'll be consequences." I told him to leave. Flat voice. No emotion. He smiled like that was funny. They got back in the SUV and drove off without hurrying, like they wanted me to watch them go. I did. Then I wrote everything down while it was still fresh, down to the way the driver checked his mirrors. That night, I didn't sleep at the cabin. I set my systems and pulled back to a ridge where I had a clear view and better signal. I launched the drone just after midnight, letting it climb high enough that the sound disappeared into the wind. Infrared lit the forest like a different world, warm bodies glowing against cold ground. It took less than 20 minutes. The same SUV came back without headlights. They parked farther out this time, out of sight of the main camera. Two heat signatures moved through the trees, slow and deliberate. One headed for the roofline, the other crouched near the driveway. I watched in real time as the first one climbed, tested the edge of the old shingles, and started levering upward with something flat and metal. The second reached into a bag and scattered something across the dirt. small, sharp shapes that reflected faintly even in infrared. I recorded everything: angles, timing, faces when the drone dipped low enough. When they left, I waited another hour before retrieving the drone and backing up the footage in 3 separate places. That wasn't paranoia. That was process. By morning, the damage was clear. 2 shingles cracked, 1 beam gouged, and a neat spread of tire spikes right where a vehicle would naturally turn in. No accident, no ambiguity. I photographed every inch before touching anything, then swept the spikes into a sealed container with gloves on. Evidence doesn't like fingerprints. I drove straight to the county sheriff's office with a hard drive, a written statement, and a timeline. The deputy at the desk tried to keep it casual until he saw the footage. Then the tone changed. I didn't push, didn't editorialize. I let the facts speak. Unknown individuals, no identification, nighttime intrusion, property damage, potential for serious injury. That last part mattered. They opened a report and told me they'd follow up. I thanked them and left, knowing exactly what follow-up usually means in a rural county with limited resources. It meant time. And time was something Pine Mirror had already decided to abuse. Back at the cabin, I upgraded from deterrence to control. Motion sensors tied into floodlights, reinforced locks, secondary barriers where they'd least expect them. I wasn't fortifying a bunker. I was shaping the environment so anyone who came back would have to choose between retreat and exposure. They chose wrong 2 nights later. The alert hit just after 1 in the morning. West perimeter, close. I didn't rush. I let the lights come up first, let the sensors do their job. When I moved, it was quiet and deliberate. One of the men was already inside the line trying to cut a cable he hadn't realized wasn't the main one. He froze when the floodlight hit him, turned to run, slipped. I closed the distance before he recovered, took him down hard but clean, controlled the wrist, pinned the shoulder. He fought for maybe 5 seconds before he realized this wasn't going his way. I held him there, face down, while I called it in. When the deputies arrived, they found a restrained trespasser with a fake security credential, an illegal stun device, and plastic restraints in his pocket. That changed everything. The deputies didn't treat it like a misunderstanding. That was the first good sign. The second was the way one of them stopped calling the man on the ground a security guard the moment he saw the credential up close. Cheap laminate, wrong font, expired authorization number that didn't match any county registry. The kind of thing meant to look real just long enough to scare someone who didn't know better. They cuffed him properly and read him his rights while I stepped back and let the cameras keep rolling. I didn't give statements off the cuff. I handed over my prepared timeline, the night footage, the drone video, and the container with the spikes. Everything labeled, everything documented. One of the deputies gave me a look halfway between surprise and appreciation. People who plan ahead make law enforcement's job easier. People who don't usually make it harder. The man didn't say much on sight, just stared at the ground and kept asking for a lawyer. Fine by me. Silence has weight. Before they put him in the cruiser, I noticed him glance once toward the road that led back to Pine Mirror. Not panic, not regret. Calculation. I logged that too, even though it wasn't technically evidence. Pattern recognition is a habit you don't unlearn. By the time the lights disappeared down the road, the forest felt different, quieter but tighter, like it was holding its breath. I walked the perimeter with the deputies one last time, pointing out where the roof had been damaged and where the spikes had been laid. They photographed everything, marked it, and promised follow-up. I believed them as far as procedure went. What I didn't believe was that this would stop anyone on its own. I spent the rest of the night resetting, not repairing yet. Documenting comes before fixing, but preparing. I replaced the cut cable with a decoy line and rerouted the real one underground, added redundancy to the sensors, adjusted angles so no one could approach the cabin without being seen from at least 2 directions. None of it was flashy. All of it was effective. When you design systems, you assume failure and plan around it. Pine Mirror was counting on intimidation. I was counting on inevitability. The next morning brought the response I expected, not from the men in black, but from the HOA. A certified envelope waited at the edge of my drive, stamped and formal, like that erased everything that had happened in the dark. Inside was a notice of pending boundary dispute, filed by Pine Mirror's board and signed by Karen Lowry herself. The language was careful. Allegedly, potential encroachment, Historical survey inconsistencies. The goal wasn't to win yet. It was to stall, to muddy the water, to give themselves cover. I smiled when I read it, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. They were trying to turn a criminal act into a civil distraction. That told me they were scared enough to change tactics, but arrogant enough to think I wouldn't push back. I didn't call a lawyer right away. I called a surveyor first, the same one who'd done my pre-purchase work. Licensed, meticulous, and extremely unimpressed by HOA theatrics. By noon, he was on site with his equipment, running fresh lines, confirming markers, and documenting every boundary pin that had been in place longer than Pine Mirror itself. I watched him work while I cataloged the damage from the roof incident, still untouched so no one could claim alteration. That afternoon, Karen tried calling. I didn't answer. She left a message, concerned, measured, almost sympathetic. She spoke about safety, about misunderstandings, about how unfortunate it was that outside contractors had taken things too far. No admission, no apology, just distance. I saved the voicemail and backed it up with the others. By evening, the surveyor had his preliminary confirmation. No encroachment, no overlap, not even close. The cabin sat exactly where it always had, long before Pine Mirror's first manicured lawn ever existed. He promised a full report within 48 hours. I thanked him and sent him on his way. As the sun dropped behind the ridge, I stood on the porch of a cabin that had survived weather, time, and now deliberate sabotage. The cameras were quiet, the sensors steady. Somewhere beyond the trees, an HOA board was deciding how far they were willing to go to avoid admitting fault. I already knew the answer. People who escalate once rarely stop when it costs them something. They stop when it costs them everything. The lawsuit arrived exactly when I expected it to. Early, aggressive, and dressed up to look more legitimate than it had any right to be. A courier drove it out personally, which told me Pine Mirror wanted to make a point. The packet was thick, expensive paper, the kind meant to intimidate by weight alone. Allegations of boundary violations, claims of structural encroachment, references to historic survey discrepancies that conveniently lacked dates or sources. Karen's signature sat at the bottom, neat and confident, as if ink could substitute for facts. I read it once, then again, slower. Not to understand it, I already did, but to map the strategy. This wasn't about winning on the merits. It was about slowing me down, draining time, creating doubt. If they could stall the restoration long enough, they could pressure me into selling or force a settlement that let them rewrite reality. That kind of tactic only works on people who need the fight to end quickly. I didn't. I called my attorney that afternoon, not because I was panicking, but because timing matters. She specialized in property rights and historic restorations, the kind of law that lives at the intersection of land records and people who think money bends them. I sent her everything. Survey, permits, video footage, the criminal report number from the sheriff's office, and Karen's carefully worded voicemail. She didn't react emotionally. She just asked precise questions and told me to expect a counterpunch within the week. While the legal machinery spun up, I didn't stop working. Stopping would have been exactly what Pine Mirror wanted. I reinforced the roof where it had been damaged, using period-correct materials, documenting every step. I logged hours, costs, and methods not because I enjoyed paperwork, but because accuracy is a weapon when you know how to use it. Every nail, every beam, every decision had a record now. If they wanted to claim I'd altered something improperly, they'd have to lie outright. 2 days later, the surveyor's full report came in. Clean. Detailed. Photographs, coordinates, historical references that trace the property line back further than Pine Mirror's founding documents. I forwarded it to my attorney immediately. She replied with one word: perfect. The HOA's legal team didn't wait. They filed an emergency motion seeking a temporary halt to all work, citing ongoing investigation and potential risk to neighboring properties. I almost admired the audacity. Almost. My attorney responded within hours, attaching the survey, the permits, and a supplemental affidavit from the surveyor himself. She also attached the sheriff's incident report, carefully framed as evidence of harassment and attempted sabotage rather than a separate matter. Context matters. Judges notice patterns. A week later, we were in a preliminary hearing. Not a trial, not even close. Just a judge, 2 tables, and a room that smelled like old carpet and impatience. Karen sat across from me, composed, dressed for authority. She didn't look at me directly. Her attorney spoke in practiced tones about community interest and shared expectations. Mine spoke about facts, boundaries, and criminal trespass. When the judge asked whether Pine Mirror had any physical evidence of encroachment, the room went quiet. They didn't. Not because they'd forgotten it, because it didn't exist. The judge denied the emergency motion without drama. No lecture, no scolding. Just a statement that the plaintiff had failed to meet the burden required to interfere with lawful work on private land. Karen's jaw tightened just enough to notice. That was the first visible crack. Outside the courthouse, her attorney tried to approach me. I declined to engage. My attorney handled it, professional and cold. We filed our counterclaim the same day. Trespass, harassment, property damage, intentional interference with lawful activity, defamation, where applicable. We included stills from the drone footage and photographs of the fake security credential. We didn't accuse Pine Mirror directly of ordering the sabotage. We didn't have to. We let the implication hang where it belonged. That evening, I returned to the cabin and worked until dark. There's a clarity that comes from physical labor when the rest of your life is trying to turn abstract. I reset beams, treated wood, and listened to the forest settle around me. Somewhere down the mountain, a board of people who'd never built anything real was realizing they'd picked the wrong fight. They just didn't know how wrong yet. Things changed the moment my attorney stopped calling it the HOA case and started calling it the investigation. That shift didn't happen because of anything Pine Mirror filed. It happened because someone else started asking questions they hadn't anticipated. It began quietly. A federal agent reached out to my attorney, not me, which told me everything about the direction this was going. They'd reviewed the footage I'd submitted through the sheriff's office, specifically the night recordings and the drone angles. The men in black hadn't just been careless. They'd been familiar. Their movement patterns, their equipment, the way they coordinated entry and exit. It rang bells for people whose job it is to notice those things. One of the faces had already appeared in another case file, different state, different HOA, same tactics. I was asked formally and politely to preserve all original data and not alter my security setup. I was also advised, off the record, that what I'd experienced might not be an isolated incident. Apparently, Pine Mirror wasn't the first aesthetic community to suddenly hire unmarked muscle when paperwork didn't work. That was the moment I stopped feeling like a defendant and started feeling like a witness. Over the next week, the pace accelerated. Subpoenas went out. Financial records tied to Pine Mirror's operating accounts were pulled. Shell payments, consultant fees, vague line items that didn't match landscaping or maintenance. One of them matched a private contracting firm that no longer officially existed, the kind that dissolves itself after enough complaints pile up, the kind that leaves behind people who know how to scare homeowners without asking too many questions. The man I'd restrained on my property didn't hold out long. My attorney told me he'd requested a deal. The fake credential wasn't the problem. That was small time. The problem was what else he could be tied to. When he started talking, names started surfacing. Not just Pine Mirror, other associations, other problem properties, other homeowners who'd sold fast after unexplained incidents they couldn't quite prove. Patterns again. Always patterns. Karen tried to get ahead of it. She gave a statement claiming the men had been hired independently by a third party, someone she believed was a licensed security consultant. She framed herself as a victim of deception, someone who'd only wanted to protect her community. It might have worked if she hadn't paid them directly. It definitely would have worked if she hadn't followed up with written instructions that crossed the line from observation into pressure. Emails have a way of surviving intentions. By the time agents showed up at Pine Mirror's administrative office, the board was already fracturing. Members resigned quietly. Others lawyered up. Meetings were canceled. Notices stopped appearing. The community that had once been so unified in its outrage suddenly found better things to do than defend Karen's vision of harmony. Fear does that. It makes people reconsider how much loyalty they actually owe. I wasn't asked to testify yet. I wasn't even interviewed again. That told me they already had what they needed from me. I kept restoring the cabin, one careful decision at a time, while the world beyond the tree line tightened around the people who'd tried to push me out. Reporters started calling. I didn't answer. Silence, when chosen, is as deliberate as speech. One evening, as I was sealing a restored beam, I heard helicopters moving through the valley. Not close enough to see, but close enough to recognize the sound. It wasn't dramatic. No lights, no sirens. Just motion. Systems moving where systems move best. The next morning, the sheriff stopped by. Not official. Not in uniform. He told me casually that the county had been asked to cooperate with a federal inquiry into coordinated harassment involving multiple HOAs across state lines. He also told me that Pine Mirror's board was no longer authorized to act on behalf of the association pending review. That part, he said, had gone over about as well as you'd expect. I thanked him and went back to work. The cabin didn't care about jurisdictional shifts or legal fallout. It only cared that the joints fit, the load transferred correctly, and the roof didn't leak. Whatever Pine Mirror had tried to build with intimidation was collapsing under its own weight. I didn't need to watch it happen. I already knew how these things end. Slowly, thoroughly, and never the way the instigators planned. The arrest didn't happen the way people imagine it. There were no flashing lights on my property, no dramatic confrontation in the woods. It happened cleanly, efficiently, the way things do when the decision has already been made, and no one is pretending otherwise. I heard about it from my attorney first, then from the local news an hour later. Karen Lowry had been taken into custody on charges related to conspiracy, hiring unlicensed armed contractors, and providing false statements during an active investigation. Pine Mirror's board wasn't named as defendants yet, but the language used by the prosecutor made it clear they were no longer protected by ignorance. By mid-morning, Pine Mirror looked like a community that had lost its spine. The main gate was open. The office was locked. Notices were being removed from bulletin boards by people who suddenly remembered they had nothing to do with any of this. Homeowners who'd once spoken confidently about standards and aesthetics now avoided cameras and each other. Authority evaporates fast when it turns out to be borrowed. The civil case moved just as quickly. With the criminal charges in play, Pine Mirror's attorneys stopped posturing and started negotiating. My attorney didn't. She amended the counterclaim, adding malicious prosecution and coordinated harassment backed by newly released evidence from the federal investigation. We submitted financial records showing HOA funds used to pay shell contractors. We included sworn statements from the detained men and corroborating timelines from other states. It wasn't a strategy anymore. It was an autopsy. The judge didn't let it drag out. Within days, Pine Mirror HOA was ordered to cease operations pending dissolution. Their assets were frozen, their authority revoked. Residents were notified that all enforcement actions taken over the previous year were under review. The same people who'd once applauded Karen's rigidity were now discovering how expensive overreach can be when the law stops looking the other way. When the damages hearing came, I didn't ask for spectacle. I asked for restitution, repair costs, lost work time, security upgrades, legal expenses, emotional distress supported by documentation and expert testimony. The final number came back just over $320,000. The judge didn't hesitate. He called Pine Mirror's actions a deliberate misuse of collective power and Karen's conduct reckless to the point of criminality. Those words mattered. They set a tone other courts would remember. One of the contractors took a plea deal, 6 years. The other cooperated fully and walked away with a reduced sentence and a permanent record that would follow him everywhere. Karen was denied bail pending trial. No speeches, no martyrdom, just procedure, the kind she'd tried to weaponize and failed to understand. That afternoon, I returned to the cabin and worked until my hands ached. The roof was finally true. The beams sat square. The structure had survived another assault, this one legal instead of physical. As the sun dropped behind the ridge, the forest felt like it had exhaled. Pine Mirror was finished, not disgraced in a headline way, not burned down, but dismantled piece by piece until nothing dangerous remained. I packed up my tools and locked the door behind me. Tomorrow, the work would continue, the kind that actually lasts. I finished the restoration in early fall when Colorado sharpens again, and everything feels more deliberate. The air thins, the light turns harder, and mistakes stop hiding. By then, the cabin no longer looked like a project or a statement. It looked complete in the quiet, stubborn way old things do when they've survived long enough to stop proving themselves. The roofline was straight, the beams locked where they belonged, the stone chimney cleaned and repointed with the same lime mix my grandfather had sworn by. No shortcuts, No modern disguises pretending to be history. If you knew where to look, you could see every decade the cabin had lived through, and the one it had just survived. The final inspection from the State Preservation Office took most of the morning. 2 specialists arrived in a county truck that had clearly seen better years, carrying clipboards worn thin by use rather than neglect. They didn't rush. They didn't posture. They walked the structure slowly, running their hands along beams, checking joinery, peering into crawl spaces most people pretend don't exist. They asked about sourcing, methods, tolerances, about what I replaced, and more importantly, what I refused to replace. I answered without hesitation. When you do the work properly, there's nothing to defend, only explain. They approved the designation just before noon. One of them shook my hand and said the cabin was now officially recognized as a protected historical structure, not preserved in amber, preserved in function. That distinction mattered more than the paperwork. When they left, the forest closed in behind them like it always had, indifferent to forms and signatures, but quietly acknowledging the outcome. News spread in the practical way things do after the drama burns out. Not headlines, those had already moved on, but calls and emails from people who cared about what came next. Local tourism coordinators asked if the cabin could be included in a regional heritage route. Architecture students requested site visits. A historical society offered to archive my documentation as a case study in private restoration done without institutional backing. I declined interviews and accepted records. Stories distort. Records don't. The plaque went up last. Hand-forged steel, darkened but not polished, mounted beside the door, where the stone still carried my grandfather's chisel marks. The text was minimal. No speeches etched into metal, no victory language, just enough to mark continuity. The kind of marker that doesn't explain itself unless someone's willing to stand still long enough to think about it. Life, after Pine Mirror, settled into a different rhythm, quieter but not empty. People began reaching out. Homeowners who'd had run-ins with their own associations, restorers dealing with pressure disguised as regulation, even a few county officials who wanted to understand where their authority actually ended. I answered selectively, not because I wanted control, but because most people don't actually want advice. They want permission to do what they already know they should. I gave it when I could. Karen surfaced only indirectly after that. Court transcripts, motions, sentencing updates forwarded by my attorney as a courtesy. Her name had lost weight. It had become a reference point, stripped of authority and intention, cited in filings the way failed systems always are, clinically, without emotion. Pine Mirror itself was gone in all the ways that mattered. Accounts liquidated, assets redistributed, bylaws voided. The neighborhood still existed, of course, but without the machinery that had convinced itself it could enforce taste with threats. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridge and the cabin lights warmed the interior, I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee and listened. No alerts, no camera pings, no engines idling where they didn't belong. The silence wasn't the absence of noise, it was the absence of anticipation. That mattered more than peace. The cabin had outlasted weather, neglect, intimidation, and bureaucracy. It hadn't needed saving. It had needed commitment. Someone willing to do the work carefully and refused to step aside when other people decided its existence was inconvenient. I locked the door that night not out of habit, but out of respect for the place, for the process, and for the simple reality that some things are worth protecting precisely because they don't belong to anyone else's vision.